Hello and welcome to the In Kindness We Rise podcast. The podcast where we show the world that kindness is indeed still all around. My name is Patricia Lübeck. I'm a nurturer, a healer and a protector, and I'm so delighted to share this second episode with you. Today we talk to George Wright, who's an animal communicator and the host of the podcast Wild Voices. Having been born in Tasmania, Australia, into a very unique animal-loving family where his parents owned, built and operated several of the largest wildlife parks in East Australia at the time, George grew up with a deep and profound love for animals and nature as a whole. George trained with Nancy Windhard as an animal communication practitioner and has been helping humans and their animals around the world ever since. George is not just great at what he does, he is also one of my all-time favorite humans. So much so that I take his guidance and care when it comes to my cat Lila, who, let's face it, I'm pretty much unhealthily attached to. In today's episode, we talk about George's experience and work with different animal species, the support and healing nature can offer us as we move towards greater kindness in our lives, and ultimate compassion in times that seem so unpredictable. Please welcome with me, George Wright.
Can you feel it? We are coming into our hearts. Can you feel it? Our new world finally starts. Now is the time. Now is the time. In kindness we rise. Now is the time. In love we rise. In kindness and love we rise. In kindness and love we rise.
Oh, George, I'm so delighted to have you on this podcast. And what our audience only now knows is that we've been chatting for about 45 minutes at this stage, and it's time to let them in on it.
I feel like I could just talk to you for hours, and I know we have before, so um, better get into some questions and things before the talk goes on for who knows how long, and then we haven't even got to the main questions or the point. So, yeah.
Well, to be fair, it definitely wouldn't be the first time. But in a way, it's also quite nice because we've come full circle at this stage, in the sense that I first knew about you or found out about you through your podcast, which I will give you a chance later to shamelessly plug. But in the time that we've spent talking that no one's heard yet, you said you weren't quite sure how we met actually. And I am very sure because I remember stalking you across the internet because I absolutely loved your podcast. It's maybe not quite true, but I generally had really, really enjoyed your podcast, and I took note of you and took note of the way you spoke to animals and the kindness in your voice and the compassion in wanting to understand the species on these planets. And so I had listened to the Great White Shark episode, which I think is episode 1, and I absolutely loved it, just absolutely adored it. And then, funny enough, you posted an interview with the brown snake just a few days after I had decided to go to Arizona for a while, and I'd been in the States quite a lot, and I was absolutely terrified of the creepy crawlies there. And then of course there was also leaving Lila, my cat, behind, and all of these things that were just absolutely terrifying to me. And so, as luck would have it, you ended up posting in a Facebook group that we're both part of, and you were asking for help, and it was exactly my expertise. And so I was absolutely over the moon, and I pitched a trade, and yeah, I'm really, really grateful to speak to you, and I'm really just delighted to extend my knowledge of you and my love for you to all of the people who are listening to this podcast, because what started as kind of trading and helping each other out with our stuff then ended up in just meeting another beautiful person to have conversations with from the other end of the world, and lovely solidarity for the earth and the land that we're on, and hopefully also just friendly conversation and care for each other.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this podcast.
And I do remember that now. I remember, and I don't want to spoil it. I'll let you explain about the snakes and things. But I found that super interesting, and it's a good story.
Oh yeah, that was fun. I'm sure we'll get to that later as well. For now, would you be willing to tell us a little bit about what it is you do? What is an animal communicator? What can we picture when we hear those words?
I realize a lot of people, and if you're like me about a decade ago, had never even heard of it before. Like, what is animal communication? What what is that? Is that even a thing in the world? Um, I like to call it interspecies communication. Animal communication, when you hear that, you think it's more just with animals, but it works with all species, and it's a intuitive form of communication that is a universal language. So it comes from our ancestors and our need to survive and be in connection with nature and animals. So it's not a gift, it's not something I exclusively hold, it's completely a skill. And unfortunately, it's a skill that in our modern world isn't so important. We don't need to know if a plant's poisonous or healing for us because we can just go down to the chemist or the pharmacy and purchase a medicine over the counter that will, that will help us there. So we don't need to be in connection with plants like that. We don't need to worry about our survival or what the weather's going to do or be connected, with the weather cycles or the seasons because we live in houses and we have heaters and our survival needs don't require us to be in connection in this way. However, so what I'm doing is something that's very, very old, and if you study ancient cultures or ancient tribes or even tribes that still exist today, especially in South Africa, the Kalahari Bushmen, the San Bushmen, they still use this in their day-to-day life. They need to because they don't get any help from the outside world. So basically, in a nutshell, I'm not sure if I've answered exactly what animal communication is, but it's a connection and an intuitive communication with another being. So, majority of my work is with animals because we live with animals. We have pets, and sometimes there's a misunderstanding there. The cat isn't using the litter box, or the dog won't stop barking, or the rooster's attacking the children. And that last one is actually a client I've had. Um, and it's basically just taking out all the guesswork and getting the animal's perspective in this case to find out why they're doing this behavior or why this is happening, because everything an animal does makes sense to them. They never do something because, oh, I'm going to do this to piss you off, or I'm going to do this because I know it upsets you. Everything they do has a purpose. They never lie. They don't do things to lie, like humans can. I have had animals that do divert the truth, so it's not lying, but it's um, like cats, especially one that I can remember that went on walkabout for a couple of days and never does that. Only goes out for a day at a time. What had actually happened, his person had locked him in through the day, so he missed out on a day. He was out through night. He went out through the night, then the next night he was then out from the next day, and then the next night he came home. And in his mind, because he was allowed out through the day anyway, he only felt he was gone for one night. So he didn't feel it was a whole weekend he was gone. He was, from his perspective, he said, no, I'm allowed to be out through the day, so I was only gone for one night, and then I came back the following night, at like 1 or 2 a.m. So, but from the human perspective, he was gone for the whole weekend. So you can see how that kind of it generally is a misunderstanding. And when we can see the animal's perspective, and even when the animal can see ours, like my own cat Simba, who used to love waking us up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in the morning. And I communicated with him one day that humans need to sleep through the night. We need to sleep when the sun sets and the sun wake. We're not like a cat who can sleep for 10 minutes and then be wide awake and nap through the day. We need about 8 hours. And I said, you can wake me up when the sun comes up. And it worked brilliantly for a few days. And then he went back to the way things were. So that's when you need to do a little bit kind of like a child. If you tell them something or you ask them something, you then have to remind them of them occasionally. And of course, all animals are different. I have had some animals that will completely take it on board after the communication and change their behavior like that, and they never go back. However, my cat, who I'm talking about, he's a little bit, um, I'll say, confident and sure of himself. So he's like, okay, I understand that. I'll do that for a day or two. But then after that, he's like, nah, I'm not into this. I want to, I want attention and I want food at 3 a.m. So I'm going to go back to waking you up. And that's when, you know, you need to communicate or have some training or behavioral kind of resources that you can reinforce that with. So, animal communication isn't instead of training, it definitely isn't instead of any veterinary practice. It all works in companionship with all those. It's very complementary to that. So, when people ask me, what is it that you do? I say, I'm the step before a behavioralist or a trainer. So if you're not sure what's going on, and there are some behavioralists and trainers like Jackson Galaxy who I feel actually use communication without even knowing it. So they know what's going on with the animal, so then they can implement practices and training and things that are suited exactly to that. But there are a lot of trainers and things that are just basing it on experience. And experience, of course, is a great thing. However, you're still guessing in a way. So, with animal communication or interspecies communication, you're taking all the guesswork out. You know exactly why the animal feels they need to do this or what's wrong in their life, why they're behaving this way. And then it's easy to implement, certain training or things like that that might be needed in that situation.
It's maybe also a very different perspective, if I'm hearing you right, in the sense that it's not so much about fixing your animal or fixing their behavior, deeming them as wrong or just a nuisance, but instead it's about really actively wanting to co-create a happier experience and a happier life for everyone involved, including you and your pet, and maybe even all the animals, all the species on the planet, right?
Definitely. Exactly. And that's why sometimes all they need is communication, all they need is to be heard. And then they're like, okay, my voice has been heard. Now I don't need to be like that. I feel a lot of times animals will try and get our attention. They can't speak English. They can't speak that language. So how are they going to get our attention? Well, if they pee on the couch, you're going to notice that. And that it could be a simple thing like something's not right in my life. Can you pay attention to me? Unfortunately, because a lot of people feel they can't communicate with their animals, and if you're like me, you've always talked, to your animals. They get that, they hear that, they get the energy behind what you're saying. That's why if you're hiding, the leash, if you've got to go to the vet and you're hiding the leash behind your back and you're saying, let's go to the park, come on, let's go play at the park. Your dog's getting an image of the vet and the park and the leash behind your back and being very confused. So
Oh, yeah, that's such a human thing to do, deception at the face of vulnerability. It's what we do with children a lot, right? When something difficult is happening in life or when we're not quite sure how to approach a topic, we just lie or shove it under the rug rather than step into that vulnerability with each other.
Exactly, yeah. We think it would be easier for them. You know, it's easier not to tell the dog we're going to the vet because he hates the vet, where in actual fact, they can handle it if you tell them exactly what's going on. They might hate it, they might still resist, but the fact is they're going to trust you more. And eventually, hopefully, they'll get to that point where they're like, you know, you've never lied to me. I really trust you. Let's just get it done. Um, and of course, all animals are different. You can't generalize. They're as varied as us people. Some are incredibly enlightened, incredibly wise. Others kind of, they're fairly new here. I would say that they haven't been around very much, and everything's kind of new and exciting, like a child, just like a child. So you've got to come at them from their understanding, but majority of communication is a misunderstanding, and I like to think I'm that bridge between human and animal and clear up that misunderstanding, take the guesswork out of things, and basically I know I've been talking for quite a while, but that is animal communication. That is what I do basically.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
So you're really just a bridge between, in this case, the animal and their human,
exactly.
and you're really translating the energetic experience that is quite hard to put into a specific language, but is kind of universal between all species.
Yes, yes. So I am a translator. Um, yeah, that's what I say, and the hardest part of my job is not interpreting the information too much. And any animal communicator will say this, and this is what makes animal communicators different or not all equal, I guess. Generally, the longer you've been doing it and the more experience you have, the less you interpret or the better language you find to describe what you're feeling. And that's what I personally struggle with the most is I feel something, this slight nuance, but we don't have an English word to describe it. And it's very difficult to try and describe so many different things, especially if I'm working with a multi animal household and two of the animals feel similar. So, they might feel a little bit anxious, but the anxiousness I feel in two different animals has a different nuance to it. And to try and explain that to the client or the person I'm working with can be quite tricky.
That really resonates with me because obviously my mother tongue, my native language is German, but then on top of that, I grew up with my mum and my grandmother and my sister speaking a dialect that is really, really descriptive. It's quite unique to the place that we come from,
Ah,
and it was always kind of considered like a lower language, but actually it has a lot of character and a lot of emotive expression.
yes,
And so, coming from that background, even looking at the English language, it's not very easy to do this kind of communicating on the basis of English because it's a language that is not quite as rich in emotive expression, at least not in the common way that we speak it.
yes,
And I don't think that's just to do with English not being my native language. I think that has just to do with kind of the history of the people and the land and the way it progressed. Whereas some of the European languages that I speak, like German and Italian,
yes.
they're really, really rich in emotive expression. So translating between species is one thing, but then finding ways of expressing, yeah, that kind of emotive literacy in English is a whole other ball game, isn't it?
Exactly. And there's so many different nuances with animals because we are different species. So how do you communicate exactly how an animal's feeling something if there's no correlation to that in the human world? And like, not to say they're so different that they feel different emotions, but they, like you said with anger, there's different nuances of anger. Especially, I can think of some recent cases with dogs that were, you know, that had fear aggression. That's pretty common. If you a behaviorist or you've worked with a trainer, fear aggression's, pretty common in dogs, but there's so many nuances for why they feel angry and why they feel frightened. And if I say, oh, they're just anxious, that it's so general that it doesn't cover, it doesn't, and that's the hardest part of my job, is to try and interpret the information, but not interpret it so much that I've put my own spin on it, or I've taken away from what the animal genuinely wanted to share.
Yeah, that's something I've noticed in your podcasts as well. Sometimes when I listen, I hear you say something that the animal species has brought forward, and then you kind of admit that you're not quite sure what they mean by that, but you don't want to interpret it either. So you just leave it at that. Whereas I'm such a nosy Rosie, I really want to know, and I feel like going in and harassing the species and figuring it out. My mind is very much in that I want to know this kind of space. So I always laugh to myself when you kind of leave it at it and respect whatever has been brought forward.
And you can definitely do that. You can, like, if you're not sure, you can always ask for more information. Generally, a lot of my communications I receive through feeling sensors. So I get a feeling for what it is, and I'm just trying to describe it through words. And that's what I was talking about, can be very tricky, and what you were saying.
That's really interesting. And you do that actually really, really well. You're really good at sharing rather than interpreting or putting your own spin on it. I'm wondering a little bit if you seem to communicate with species who you really care for, and I'm wondering if your wish to be that kind of translator is one of the reasons for that.
It seems to have gone that way. So I wanted to work with animals that were probably what I assume to be the most misunderstood. So if I have a look at my podcast, and I should say that to clarify, explain a bit what the podcast is. So I'm not just communicating with one animal. So, like you said, the first one I did was an eastern brown snake. They're a species of Australian snake, and if you guys haven't worked out already, I am Australian, of course. And it's the second most deadly snake in the world, so there's a lot of fear and stigma around that. And I did the communication coming into our summer, when in my community the fear and things starts coming up, because we see them everywhere, and everyone walks their dogs around the lake here, and there's always a lot of fear. So I wanted to start with them. So what I do is I communicate with the whole species group. So, like I say in the podcast, one spokesperson, one spokesbeing could come forward, or it could be a few, kind of like on a panel, or it could be something else, like the oversoul or the collective of that animal species that I'm communicating with. I don't actually know. So so I feel the connection. I get the connection with the eastern brown snakes. I feel the connection. I'm not sure if I'm talking to an individual or a few. I do realize though that because the answers are fairly general and fairly broadly specific, that it is, either the collective or a few at once that I'm communicating with. It's not, because when I do my consultations with a person and their animal, it's very clear that I'm communicating with that one animal, and not, if I'm working with a dog, I'm not tuned into the dog collective. It's one on one, the same way you and I are talking right now. So the podcast is a little bit different in the sense that the communication is a lot broader, the answers are a lot more generalized, but I like that because it's helpful for a lot more people. We're all so different that one answer might make sense to me, but you might have no sense to you. You don't understand it. But the podcast in this way, it makes sense to a bigger audience. So it's able to help more of us. And of course, it's free. And the intention was give animals that don't really have a voice so much in our world, a chance to speak. And that's why I created it. So,
And from that perspective, your list of interview episodes, your podcast, makes a lot more sense, because you had the snake, the shark, the wolf, I think maybe you had the bee, and then you had the chicken.
yeah,
And I remember just really enjoying your podcast anyway, and not necessarily because they were these strong predators, but they were all really kind of fierce hunters and predators. And then suddenly you had the chicken pop up, and I thought that was really, really funny. So I think that was maybe when I started catching on that you may have like a personal care or a personal concern for those kind of species.
yes. And some of it's seasonal. So, say the chickens, I communicated with them just before Christmas time. And, I wanted to give them a voice, at least here in Australia. It's quite popular to have chicken or turkey, for the Christmas meal. So I wanted to give them a voice on the other side. And then I worked with, the wolves, sharks, brown snake. The honeybees was also one. It was coming into winter, so obviously for us here in Australia. And the honeybees, they've done all their work. They've been working for a long time. They start to go in hibernation and things like that. I know they don't technically hibernate, but their activity really slows down. Then, dolphins, that was a request. A lot of people wanted me to communicate with dolphins. And then I worked with wedge-tailed eagles, and then deer, and then most recently the COVID-19 virus, which was very different because I did have a lot of people write in saying they weren't aware that you could communicate with a virus, and it's totally possible.
Because it's a consciousness rather than a particular kind of person or an individual.
Exactly, exactly.
We'll get back to that right in 1 second. One of the reasons I felt like investing time and effort into this podcast was not just to spread kindness around the world, but also to get a better understanding of what kindness is. Like, there were immediately people I'd think about when it comes to kindness and lifting each other up, and you're really one of them. Mostly so because a huge part of kindness to me is a sense of making each other feel safe. And especially when you posted the COVID communication, I was in a place of a lot of fear because I was so separate from my family and there was loads happening. But I knew that if I clicked on your podcast, it would be a safe thing to listen to, and I would ultimately come away feeling more connected and less afraid.
That's beautiful. That's wonderful. That's the whole aim, I guess, is to take I guess you could say, superstition or the fear out of things. Like I said, with the snake, there's a lot of fear here in Australia. It is getting better. People, I'm seeing more and more photos of snakes and videos of people seeing one on a path, and instead of freaking out and trying to kill it or something, they're like, oh, wow, this is cool, and they're taking a photo. So I feel things are changing, but the virus was a big one because as everything started happening in the world, I'm a human too. I was frightened as well, like many of you probably were. And it wasn't a request, but some other animal communicators had communicated with viruses in the past and got a little bit of information, but I wanted to do a whole podcast because I was fearful. And I wasn't so fearful for my own health because I'm fairly young, I'm nice and healthy, I live in a small community. It's But there was that fear, and it was fear within myself, but also collective fear. And I really wanted to, like in all the podcasts, I wanted to give that being a chance to speak. And actually, after communicating with it, I felt much better. I felt less frightened of it. And so many people have written in and said how much it did help them during this time.
The thing that you do so beautifully is bridging the gap as well, right? So obviously the virus is something that has caused a lot of pain in a lot of people's lives, and it is something that a lot of humans are quite strongly afraid of.
Totally.
So holding that truth and holding that perspective while also talking to a being and hearing its perspective, or a consciousness and hearing its perspective, takes a certain kind of skill and compassion, I guess. And so as we move towards a kinder society, and as we move towards a kinder way of being with each other, I think that we have to become better at bridging each other's perspectives and seeing each other as important pieces in like an overall puzzle, rather than arguing over who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah.
And you do that really, really gorgeously, not just in the sessions with me and my cat, but also in all of the podcast episodes that I've listened to, or anything that you share online.
That's a really interesting insight. I haven't really thought of it that way myself, but I did realize that the struggle for me doing the COVID-19 communication was the time when I released it on the 20th of March, when everything, had already gone quite crazy, but worldwide started really ramping up. And I was aware, doing this podcast and sharing this, there's probably people right now that have COVID-19 that are very close to leaving their bodies, or, have already left. So it's very hard to, how do you communicate with that other side when there is immediate, threat to your life and your safety there? Can you hear that other side of the story? Can you be open enough or curious enough to listen, but still be in that survival place? And I think that's exactly how our ancestors used to come from. Like I said at the very beginning, they relied on this for their survival. They were able to feel if there was a jaguar hanging down from a tree before they got there, and the jaguar, is a perfect ambush predator, before the jaguar dropped from the tree and ate you, basically. So they were connected with the jaguar, but you see what I mean? There was that fear and that threat to their safety. However, they had a deep connection. And when I say connection, it's of course love. It's a loving connection. You can't connect with another being or something through fear. You can only connect with it through love. So, so the fact that our ancestors were able to connect with these animals and these beings and things that would happily take their lives, they were able to do that. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. When I was talking to you about the black snake, or getting that initial connection with you, it was less about me feeling that like the snakes and all the creepy crawlies had it out for me. It was more a sense of knowing that I don't really understand how to live in harmony with those species. Like, I mean, I come from a continent that has very few poisonous animals to begin with, but also there aren't really any snakes in Germany, and in Ireland we're all about like having gotten rid of the snakes. Like, there's no snakes in Ireland. So it wasn't really that I was afraid of the land there, or that I was in a space of fear. It was more of a recognition that I had gotten so far away from the land and from being in unity with it, that I felt a bit like a bull in a china shop. Is that a thing?
Yep, I know that saying.
Yeah, totally. Like, I felt like this massive giant just completely clumsily trampling around this miniature town, and I was really conscious that I was invading someone else's territory, and I had this deep love for that space that I hadn't met yet, and knowing that my ignorance and my clumsiness could cost us both our lives.
This is when you traveled to the USA, isn't it?
Yeah, I should probably say that. I was traveling to the US. I was worried about the creepy crawlies, and we talked about all of that, and you helped me connect to the snakes there, particularly because the snakes and the scorpions were what I was most afraid of. And so when I went there, I took with me this sense of calm that I do have the ability to tune in things to our session. And actually, when we first talked about it, you kind of laughed at me, and you didn't make fun of me, but you kind of said, what are you being worried about anyway? There's no chance at all that you're ever going to meet one of those creatures. You're kind of in the city. You're only there for a little while. You've nothing to worry about.
Anyway.
Oh dear, wasn't that a mistake to say?
It really was. I met all of the creepy crawlies there were.
Wow.
So many creepy crawlies. But within 24 hours of getting there, I was being outside with a couple of people, and there was this tiny, cute little baby rattlesnake that slithered past us and found some shade under a big urn, kind of to get away from the lunchtime heat. And it just kind of looked at us and kind of checked us out, and then curled up away from us really peacefully to go to sleep. And in that moment, I was so captured by emotion, because on the one hand, it was just the cutest thing, and I felt so much love for this little snake that I had feared so strongly. Like, my worst fear was meeting a snake, and then when it happened, my heart was just so full of love. I nearly went to pick it up because my instinct was just to love it like a baby human. But there was also this huge love because it was so safe for this tiny creature to sleep in peace. And I was just feeling this massive gap between how absolutely amazing that moment was and how rare that moment was, and how unsafe as a species we humans have become for all of the other creatures and beings on this planet.
And that's beautiful what you said, that you realize that we are kind of dangerous for animals to be around. And that's exactly how you can tell. It's a good gauge of how, I guess you could say, in tune you are, not with things externally, but in tune with yourself, your own thoughts, your feelings, stuff like that, is if wild animals are okay with your presence. If they don't run off, if they don't, they're not in a desperate dash to get away from you. And of course, there's always animals, and I'm thinking here in Australia, kangaroos, and we have deer here, that as soon as they see you on the horizon, they're gone. However, my understanding of that is humans here in Australia don't really have good relationships with either of those beings, for example. So even though I might be walking there and I'm kind of pretty grounded and pretty calm, and my thoughts and emotions aren't, projecting out everywhere that the animals can pick up on, I'm still a human. And they see me and they run because that's what they've been taught to do. I was just going to say, I find it really wonderful when wild animals, especially, will let you near, and you should take it as a very beautiful, almost thank you from them. Like, you're obviously in a place where they are okay with you being there. Because a wild animal can always leave, generally, especially birds, or like, deer, they can run. They can take off and jump fences, and so it's wonderful when a wild animal will let you close to it in its presence, and you're obviously doing something right in that moment. So take it as a beautiful message, and definitely be grateful for that, because it's not something that
Yeah.
many humans get to experience. And gratitude in those moments is so powerful and important.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I feel so hugely blessed, and actually, not just the snake, but I also have a beautiful story of like being under the full moon in the mountains, walking like a big labyrinth, a meditative labyrinth, and right in the center being two little scorpions. And yeah, there's so many amazing memories and connections. Yeah, I feel like a piece of me is in that land now.
And our biggest thing is we've forgotten that we're part of that land. So we're just as much a part of nature and the natural world as the wild animals are. And that's what we've forgotten. And that's what we've tried to almost run away from. And that has caused a lot of issues. And that seems to be because one of the questions I ask on the podcast of all the animals, all the beings is, advice to help us humans. What can we do? What should we do in the world to be more connected, to come back to our own wild nature? And they pretty much all say to come back to ourselves, like to come back to presence, to come back to being outside, which is obviously difficult for some of us right now because of the current lockdown and things. But it's a common theme and message that keeps coming up. The animals, recommend us to come back to ourselves, so to stop running. And I know we were talking about this before the podcast, to stop running from our own emotions, our feelings, what's going on in our life, which is easier said than done. I will be the first to admit that. I'm not always with it. I'm not always hanging around with those more difficult emotions.
Yeah, those heavy emotions. We just spoke about Lee Harris before we started recording, and how he said that, the fear and the terror and all of the things that humans are feeling at this time are such a gateway to empathize with each other better and open ourselves up to deeper compassion. And when he said that, I kind of lost a little bit of hope, just because I felt like there's no way on earth that I could feel any more, or that I could handle witnessing any more suffering. Like when he said that, it was like my heart was gonna burst. And actually, Lila, my cat, has probably been the best teacher of that, of kind of outgrowing the pain I thought I could feel. So anytime she has a tricky patch or she's got any health issues, I keep reminding her that it is her choice to leave, and that I'd much rather be left behind with all of the grief and all of the pain than have her suffer. So there's this ultimate sense of compassion and selflessness when I think of her. Would you like to talk a little bit about how animals do that to us?
Yeah, that's a big question.
No pressure.
I have no idea where I should start with that. I think the recurring theme that, and I get this a lot from the podcast, but also through animals and clients I work with about kindness, is animals' amazing capacity to still have compassion and love for us no matter what we do in the world. So think of, clear cutting the rainforest, strip mining the ground, polluting the air and the water. The animals that live in those habitats, yes, sometimes they can be, and I'm thinking of the great white sharks here, they can be a little bit pissed off at some of the things we're doing. However, one of the questions and I'm thinking of the podcast again here, is there anything you want to share? Is there any special message you want to share or you want to tell us humans? And they always share how much they love us and how much they care about us. And I think this also goes on from what we were talking about in the virus, being able to hold this fear, but also have this kind of curious, inquisitive nature through a loving connection to want to hear what it wants to share. And that's exactly how the animals are. Even factory farmed animals, believe it or not, still hold a lot of compassion towards humans and towards humanity in general. Maybe they don't have so much compassion to the people who are looking after them. And I am generalizing here. There are plenty that do, believe it or not, and that can be very hard for some people to hear because it challenges the way we think about the world. If you're in that kind of deep suffering and pain and violence and fear, how can you possibly have compassion for the ones that are doing that to you? And I think that's the biggest thing that the animals are offering us, and especially the chickens. I remember in the chicken podcast, they shared, and if you think of chickens in general, you could imagine that most chickens in the planet, there's not many wild or free chickens. Of course, there are in, wilder countries and things like that. But majority of chickens are probably in some kind of factory farm situation. And they shared that there is a lot of suffering in that. There is a lot of hardship in that. But it's their way to offer us humans a different way. It's like, look at what's going on. Look at what's happening to us. Don't you want to do this differently? And they keep showing up. And that's a very hard thing for some people to hear. It and it does challenge the way we think of the world. And I can't really explain it any better than that. I think that's something that the me as a human, I struggle myself. You can probably hear I'm like, I don't know how to exactly explain it. I can feel what they're talking about, but it doesn't fully rest in my being yet. I am getting an understanding of it, but I'm like, how? How can you possibly be like that in that kind of situation and still be, you know, loving and compassionate and kind? And that's the thing I'm trying to dig into. I'm trying to understand.
Oh boy. Yeah, maybe that's something to apply to our own lives right now, whatever is happening in the world, there's definitely a large portion of deception, and as we uncover things and as we realize things, it's kind of going to be up to us how we're going to deal with mess ups in our world and how we gonna hold people accountable without swapping into hate and into punishment, whether that's our governments or whether that's people in our lives, whatever comes up. So it's really our choice. Will we go into like French Revolution mode and tear it all down, or will we start to hold compassion for those who have messed up and stay united and stay in kindness, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And in a way, I guess there's also this teaching from the animals that brings me into a wider perspective than myself. If it was just for humans, I often feel a bit like a grumpy toddler, and I'm not even sure why I'm offering my healing work and why I'm helping people, because we're all just going to screw it all up again anyway. And then Lila hops into the window, and of course I want to have a beautiful, safe world for her and for the children that I take care of. And then I sit outside in the garden, and the birds just start singing their songs, and it's like the tone of their sound completely transforms my cellular reality. And I get a bit grumpy. I often say to the birds, "Excuse me, I'm trying to be hopeless here. Can you just stop changing my world?" But there is a sense of looking further that comes up through animals.
Yes. And that's what I'm personally trying to learn myself. But like I said, I'm learning that from nature. It's like as everything in the world seems to be going crazy, the natural world, there's this beautiful vibrancy and this life, and everything's carrying on as normal. And it's very refreshing to be in that because it's like, oh, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, it's that thing again, like we mentioned before. It's not one or the other, but we do go into mad chaos and fear, and loads of things are changing on this planet. And at the same time, there is the stillness available. Yeah, you're wise as always. I'm wondering, as we're coming towards the end of this chat portion of our podcast, is there anything, do you have a nugget of wisdom from working with nature and with animals and communicating amongst the species?
Oh, wow, another massive question. I think the biggest thing nature offered to me was when I was suffering a lot of anxiety and depression and things like that. nature was the only place that kind of reset me or refreshed me. So every time I would go out into nature, it was like, chalk on the blackboard, the chalk's all wiped off, and you're like a clean slate again. And I was having to go into nature quite often for that because at that time I wasn't working as an animal communicator. I was studying animal communication. It was a difficult time. I was working in a intense place. It was not where I'm living now. It was on the other side of the country. And nature was the one thing that kept me sane. Nature and the animals, of course. When I say nature, I don't just mean the trees and the grasses and the rocks and things like that. I mean the wild animals. And of course, my own animals and things at home are included in that. But it was kind of the one thing that kept me sane, basically, in what seemed like a crazy world at the time.
Oh, yeah, I'm very familiar with that. I've got gorgeous trees and mountains and beings around me. And it's quite a funny thing as well that humans are learning right now, right? There was an Italian mayor who kept shouting at his people because they all started going out for runs. And he was kind of shouting at them in Italian really like, severely about, kind of not getting off the couch and the sofa for years. And now suddenly everyone's a marathon runner and, kind of asking them what's wrong with them. So kind of when we're in lockdown, it seems like going out in nature has become this quiet, naughty act of rebellion.
I also feel it's like a deep need as well because we are all struggling. And at the start of the year, we were having bushfires here in Australia, and clients I worked with around the world were struggling. I know you guys had floods up there in the UK, and this was before the virus, when it was just located in one area. And everyone I spoke to came into the start of this year with a challenge. There was something going on. It could be deeply personal, like a health issue or a family crisis, or it was like a community, country kind of struggle. But everyone I spoke to seemed to come in this year into 2020 with something going on that was intense, that was difficult. And I'm sure looking back now, it was a lead up to what's going on now. But at the same time, there's also this deep need for people to, like I said, maybe they don't realize it, but there's this deep need, this longing, because we are just as much a part of nature when the human world seems to be very shaky and very rattly. Inside, our body knows what it needs, and it's to get outside, it's to go for a walk, it's to be out in the sun, it's to hear the birds. I'm sure there is a bit of a rebellion there as well because we are social creatures as humans. I know I am, and when you're told to stay in your house and not leave and not interact with anyone, that can be very challenging for us humans. So there is definitely a part of rebellion there. I understand that. But I also think there's like this deep call, this longing. And maybe you can comment on this. Maybe we're going off track a little bit, but I've been taught that with trauma and things, especially, that the body knows exactly what it needs to heal. You just have to learn to tune in and listen to that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When we experience trauma, there is an anchoring of that experience, obviously in our emotion and in our psyche and our mind, but it also anchors very much in our physical body, in our auric field, in the plasma in our body, in all of these energy layers that we don't really talk about. So there is a field of somatics where we work with the whole of the human, not just the mind, not just the body, but it all together. And yeah, so our body knows how to fix us or how to get our attention, just like cats. And it's also really interesting how you say about going out and finding stillness there, because trees obviously take good care of us too. So when we go to trees, they tailor their terpenes, I think that's how you say it, to the hormone levels of the humans that are around. So someone with cancer goes, for example, the terpenes they send out are tailored to that, and if like a healthy person goes, there'll be a very different release in the air. That's why it's so good to go after rain, because then the air is particularly full of terpenes. And I'm not quite sure if that is a selfless act or not. I sometimes joke and think, if someone kept coming into your home very smelly, you would probably give them a bar of soap eventually, or offer new clothes, or help solve the problems. So I'm not sure if trees are out there to help us, or if we're just stinking up their space. And it's kind of like a self-defense. Who knows, maybe it's just a consequence to an action. But there's incredible research on community and communication that trees are capable of. So I always choose to believe that there is a benevolence there.
Yeah, definitely. And trees are actually our most ancient ancestors, believe it or not, if you weren't aware of that, because trees were the first beings basically to learn how to capture the sunlight for energy. And because of that, all life could then exist on the planet. But trees were kind of that first point. So, if you want to go back that far, trees are actually our ancestors. So, there is a deep connection there. And that's why it's so helpful. And this can be part of the practice I offer is if you're feeling very ungrounded or your emotions are quite crazy, is to go and sit with your back to a tree. Because not only is the back of our body intuitive, the front of our body is the moving forward and the more logical side, the back of our body, the people that say, oh, the hairs stood up on the back of my neck, that's, your intuitive side. So when you sit with your back to a tree, not only does it ground you, but the tree also helps you balance some of those emotions and energies. And I honestly feel from what I've got from trees that it's not like giving you a bar of soap thing. It is a compassionate thing. Like the trees see us as little children running around, kind of learning about the world and not really understanding things. And the trees are like our elders, basically. You can think of it like that. I like to.
Oh, yeah, that feels really, really powerful, actually. I really love that thought of trees being our ancestors and our caretakers in a way. And it does feel really true to me. I have just developed hay fever in the last year or two, and it's really new to me. And so I've been mostly indoors, because right now is not a good time to figure out whether you can't breathe because of hay fever or you have a deadly virus. um, and so I've been kind of sitting inside and yearning for that connection more so than usual. And I was also really sad how much I had forgotten how to grow my own food and where to find the herbs that I need. And I've been really into herbalism. And so I was kind of sitting in my space in front of the window for a while, and I kept thinking about how much I'd really love some ivy, because I could make concoctions and things, and it would be really, really helpful in so many ways. And just literally a week later, my fairy tree outside that window started growing ivy, and the lawn in the back, which was completely just pure grass for years, suddenly started growing all sorts of like great weeds like dandelions and all of the little allies that could really help us at this time. So I did kind of feel like, whether it's true or not, there was this strong sense that the earth had my back. And like, no matter how much we mess up as humans, after all that we've done to this planet, earth still loves us and provides.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's what the animals like to echo. That even after all that we've done, maybe wrong, maybe mistakes, we're still deeply loved and cared about. And I think that's the biggest form of kindness that the animals and nature want to share with us. It's not too late. We haven't been, sent off to the naughty corner, that, and we can never come back to class, basically. Like, there's always that option. The animals in nature are waiting for us to come back. And it was beautiful, remember, in the wolf podcast, how the grey wolves shared that they used to walk side by side with man. And it was both, you know, metaphorical and physical. Hunting tribes used to share with the wolves, and the wolves used to share with humans. But then the wolves shared that humans have walked off the track. We've gone off the track, and the wolf is still walking along the trail, just waiting, patiently waiting for us to come back and join the trail next to them. And I thought that was beautiful, the way they shared it like that. And that's exactly what I think we're talking about here.
Wow. Yeah, what a note to leave this conversation on. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, your expertise, and your care. I'm really grateful for you.
No worries at all.
Thank you so much for joining. I hope you had as much fun as we did. If you would like to stay in touch or book a session with George, you can go to www.wildvoices.com.au. And if you would like to stay in touch with this podcast, In Kindness We Rise, then you can either subscribe or press the bell icon. Let us know in the comments below what your favorite animal encounter is, or any questions that we could answer for you. And until then, in kindness we rise.
In kindness and love.